Point and Click Productions, Portland Mindfulness, and I, Joe Reinwein, your host, present Face Your Doom, the next in our series entitled Buddhism Randomly. Well, we all know how this story ends. That's right, you're going to die. And so am I. We don't know this for certain. Philosophers tell us that there is deductive logic and inductive logic, and this is an example of inductive logic, which would go something like, since everyone up to this point has eventually died, therefore we will. It's more difficult or perhaps impossible to prove that we're going to die by deductive logic. However, I think it's also possible. I think famously someone, maybe Aristotle, said something like, or Plato, anyway, the syllogism was something like, all humans die, Plato is a human, therefore Plato will die. And you philosophers out there and students of philosophy can correct me about the specifics of that. However, it has long been observed that we know how this story ends. And no surprise for those of you who have dabbled at least in Buddhism, read a little bit about it, that death is pretty important in Buddhism, as it is in Western philosophy. In continental philosophy we have notably existentialism, dealing extensively with, well, things like death, categories that come along with existing. Death, and in the meantime, doubt, which is what's driving me to check that this is recording and is at a reasonable level and I'm not blowing your ears out. So we need to face our doom. Now, doom is, I believe, an Anglo-Saxon word that meant fate. Your doom is your fate. So we are doomed to die. Doom nowadays is the same as death, demise, but once it just meant your destiny, your fate. And we are doomed to die. And before then, we will inherit, as Shakespeare put it, the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. So these themes in Buddhism are hardly unique to Buddhism. In fact, maybe one hallmark of Buddhism is that it's very easily generalizable to non-Buddhists, to people of varying cultures. It doesn't, in its most basic form, it doesn't really require much faith in anything supernatural. Some claim it does, others claim it doesn't. I am of the latter school of thought. Being involved in Zen Buddhism, we tend to believe that you don't need to believe certain things. It's more about doing certain things. In that sense, it's sort of a Nike religion. What someone once described Judaism as a Nike religion. Just do it. And no, I'm not getting paid by Nike, even though we do have a big center of that company here in Portland, Oregon. I don't get along with corporations. So I don't get kickbacks from anyone. Well, how do we go about facing our doom? Well, there's a lot of ways we can work with this. Preparing for death is a whole topic in itself and worth another video or even a series of videos. And I don't even necessarily think I'm going to make them because I don't know how expert I am on that. But what I want to tell you about today is one way that those of us who practice something along the lines of Buddhism or something inspired by Buddhism, pause for a coffee sip. While I'm still here, I'm going to drink coffee. So this method is known as the Four Remembrances. And interestingly, there's been some degree of study, some attempt to understand the basis of so-called happiness, of people who would report that they're happy with their lives. And interestingly, they've even developed a like gross domestic product for countries. They have something called gross domestic happiness index, something like that. And if I am recalling correctly, countries where we have the practice of a daily reminder of death, people report higher levels of happiness. It's exactly the opposite of what maybe someone from our society might think at first glance at this issue, that, oh, well, that's morbid to think about death. Well, I suppose it could be morbid. It could be a little sick if you were obsessing about it. But a daily reminder that one will die turns out to be associated with better rather than worse mental health. And I think it's particularly so if it is intentional. It's not an obsessive compulsive process of having that thought and then fighting against it. It's choosing to have that thought. It is deliberately reminding oneself. So in Buddhism, in some streams of Buddhism, not Judaism, I'm interested in both, and Judaism, Buddhism, Buddha Judah. Anyway, the Four Remembrances. And in my community out here in Oregon, the Four Remembrances are translated something like this. 1. I am of the nature to die. There is no way to avoid death. 2, and this might not be the order, but I'm going to do them in this order. 2, I am of the nature to grow ill. There is no avoiding becoming ill in this life. 3, I am of the nature to grow old. And I've talked before about some of the signs that I am aging since I started this channel. A lot more of my head is bald and a lot more of my beard is gray are some of the more easily visible attributes of mine that clearly show aging. And 4, everything's going to disappear. Everyone I love will die. Everything I love will fall apart and disappear. So those are the 4 remembrances. I don't think in that order, but those are the 4. And basically, we're reminding ourselves every day about impermanence. I did a prior video about impermanence, for which you can go back a couple videos, watch that. Maybe 2 videos ago, thereabouts. Now, saying these things, reminding oneself each day that life is finite, that it's going to include this deterioration and this suffering, and that everything is impermanent. Oddly, the intentional practice of these reminders is associated with better mental health, as I said, is associated with more happiness, more life satisfaction. Why? Well, as we might have touched on in the video on impermanence, when we see clearly the facts, it's very difficult to debate these facts. These are things that are accepted. These statements are accepted as factual by most people across the globe. I will die someday. In the meantime, I'll probably have some illness. If I stick around and don't die young, I'll die old, which means I'll age and I'll experience aging. And 4th, everyone else is the same. I'm going to see, if I stick around long enough, I'm going to see loved ones sicken, get old, die. I'm going to see friends die. I'm going to see that which I love disintegrate, whether it is a human being, an animal, an organization, who knows what. And we might add to this formulation the rider clause, and we don't like it. We do not like it. We cling. We want things a certain way. We don't want things to change. And if we want them to change, we want them to change our way. We're not that interested in nature taking its course and things changing the way they change. Now, there was a great psychologist that many people are familiar with, Albert Ellis. I was honored to have been his client for a couple of sessions, quite intentionally. I went and paid him a visit at the Albert Ellis Institute in New York City and sat with him for a couple of sessions. And the first session was the one where I asked him all the questions that I always wanted to ask this guy. One of them was, hey, your philosophy looks a little like Buddhism. And he said, well, the Buddhists almost get it right, but they louse it up with this nirvana stuff. Well, we'll get into nirvana maybe next next video. And I don't mean the band Nirvana, although they're good too, and maybe we'll touch on them in the rock and roll series. I don't know. Not one of my top 10, but they're good. Whether we Buddhists louse up our psychology with Nirvana or not, what our theme is today is the Four Remembrances, and that we should face our doom. So being clear that some things are given. In Buddhism, by using the Four Remembrances, by using meditation, by using other skillful means, we can live very well in the light of death. The Existentialists also, as I've mentioned, emphasize that authentic living is lived in the light of death, in the light of our finitude, our limited time here, and the fact that, as the Buddha supposedly put it in his final moments of life, all composite entities are subject to decay. That's been a bit of a theme in these videos. All composite entities are subject to decay, said the Buddha. Strive diligently. And then he passed from this world into parinirvana, complete cessation of thought and therefore of suffering. Well, without going into death itself, what I'd like to maybe tie up some of the details on, since we're already at 11, 12 minutes, the reminder that this is finite, the reminder that we have limited time here, as I think I've said before, tends to promote a more mature, healthy way of looking at life. It tends to promote being a little less petty, for one, taking things a little less seriously in a beneficial way, taking myself less seriously, taking a little less hard when things don't quite go right, because, well, of course things aren't going to quite go right. Everything is disintegrating. Entropy is very real, and it's part of everyday life. And indeed, why waste time on wringing my hands about my failures or misfortunes, my own personal ones or public ones, when we could be spending our time either looking for and acting on solutions to problems, or setting aside certain problems as unsolvable or not the ones that we're choosing to base our life's work upon, and then getting on with our life's work. Or, as I like to quote from the rock and roll liturgy, quoting the sages of the band Rush and Rabbi Neil Peart, put aside the alienation, get on with the fascination. Well, it's easier to do that when we come to grips to some extent with the fact of our doom. Our long-term prognosis is not good. It all ends the same way. We're all headed in the same place as far as we know. Again, why would this help? Because it's always on our mind anyway. It's back here somewhere if it's not up here in the front, metaphorically speaking. If it's not something on your mind at the moment, we know how this ends. We are the animal that knows we're going to die. There's no evidence to point to that other animals know they are going to die. Recently, there's a popular author, John Gray, I think, who talks about cats and philosophy, and he talks briefly about elephants. Elephants seem to understand when another elephant has died, and they honor that in their behavior, the so-called elephant graveyard. Not that I know much about that, but he points out there's no evidence that elephants think a lot about their own death. It would be pretty hard to document were animals to contemplate their own death a lot. Nonetheless, whether other animals do or not, we sure do. We're planners. We're thinkers ahead. And at a certain point, when we think ahead far enough, we say, well, this is going to end in my death, so what's the point, really? It doesn't have to involve that kind of existential despair. And one way of looking at this practice of the Four Remembrances, and primarily the remembrance of death, is let's get used to it. That sounds kind of trivializing, but sometimes a simple formulation is what we need. And so maybe this kind of process that I'm coming to grips with in this video right in front of you is, let's get used to this. Let's come to grips not through logic and through careful thinking or through speculating about an afterlife or through any other fancy means, but maybe through a very simple means, which is simply reminding ourselves each day. It's a cliche. People say, live your life as if this were the last day of your life. I'm not going to go so far. You might still want to put money into your 401k because you might need it. So I'm not going to say live every day as if it were your last, at least not in a really strong, overgeneralized, from my perspective, way, but rather appreciate your life. One of the great Zen teachers in American history was Taizan Maezumi Roshi, who granted a great number of people the right to teach Buddhism, among whom are a couple of my teachers. And his book, Taizan Maezumi Roshi's book, was called, and is called, Appreciate Your Life. So one of the main messages of Buddhism is appreciate your life. Let's appreciate what is given, even if part of what is given we don't like. On average, you pick an average human being. Do you like death? Do you like the fact that you're going to have to die? We would, if we were being honest, probably say, no, I don't like that very much. But by reminding ourselves of it, we're facing our doom. And by facing something and looking at it, not obsessively, but having a look at it, maybe on a daily basis, since we humans like to push these inconvenient truths out of our minds as quickly as possible. By keeping it on the radar, we might grow more accustomed to this idea. We might find resources within ourselves, whatever they are, and they might be some kind of story about what happens after we die that might be very compelling and might actually be factual, who knows? Or it might be something very different. For me, it would be generally pretty different. I don't believe in the continuation of this particular person after this particular body disappears. The question of rebirth or so-called reincarnation, definitely one for another video. And I am not a believer in literal reincarnation. We can get into what Buddhists mean by rebirth rather than reincarnation. For now, though, let's try it out. If you want, try this for the next week. Each day, at a certain point in the day, you may choose to do this any number of ways. You could write it down. I, at some point in the future, will die. Full stop. And then the next thing you might write down is something like, therefore, today, the value or the beloved thing, person, activity, whatever, to which I will commit some of my energy is fill in the blank. So, for example, if it were me, one of my values is music, and I am not a professional musician, as it turns out, despite my fantasies about that as an adolescent. So I might write something like, because I know that someday I will die, therefore, on this day, which happens to be July 27th, 2021 by the conventional calendar used in the United States, therefore on this day I will practice guitar. Simple. Make hay while the sun shines might be one way to put it in rather American folksy terms. There's any number of ways we can use this, and hopefully people are watching, and hopefully some people will comment. If you like, put in the comments, how did you use this? How did you use this video and this practice of a daily reminder that life is finite? Did it make you less petty? Did it bother you? That's fine. You can report negative experiences. Did it inspire you? And so forth. We'll be lucky to see 1 or 2 responses, but even if there are none, ask yourselves these questions. What can I do today in response to the fact that I generally don't like to think about, that life is finite? What can I do a little bit differently today? What might I add to my day? Or what might I, though this is more difficult, what might I remove from my day? Might I be a little less petty? Might I be a little less vindictive? Might I be a little more kind? Might I be a little more focused on the things that really matter to me? And let's take it to there. Thank you, and may your week go well.